All right. I want to give people some Hegel and Marx.
Yeah.
So, because actually we do. I think we do have a fair amount of people, as example, might be in students. They might be taking this stuff or just come across it on YouTube. People are interested in ideas.
Yeah.
And they should have an opportunity to learn good ideas. But let's center it.
Yeah.
I think the idea of dialectics is actually one of the most exciting, illustrative, and it teaches. So even when I, as an example, object to moralism or tell people that you need to like deal with complexity and have infinitely more sort of like nuance, forgiveness, and compassion for fellow human beings, let alone people you're in political struggle with. And then at the same time, I also am like, people on the left need to learn how to be absolutely ruthless, serious about power, and truly crushing people, right? Who need to be in a sense of political opposition to people who hold and wield actual power. That in a way is dialectical in the sense that, and I think David Harvey was the first person who articulated this that I heard that made sense to me, is that it's a way of thinking that is not directional and linear. It's interactive and dynamic. You're, instead of looking for first principles or one roadmap for everything, you're looking at the dynamism, the interplay. That's why why it's such a great tool for even for international relations. What's happening with Iran? You have this drive from Bolton. You have China calibrating. You have all of these different principles, even in conflict, like opposing U.S. imperialism, but also having solidarity with people that maybe we're aligned with who oppose a government in Iran or Venezuela. These are all happening. Dialectics is the best, in my view, methodology for handling these contradictions in a way that doesn't just, devolve to the other extreme, which is like, hey, it's all just, hey, it's fucking complicated, bro. So what is dialectics from Hegel to Marx? What is that idea? And what is the, what's the distinction between a Hegelian and Marxist dialectic?
Yeah, so I think one way to think about what Hegel's doing is that Hegel has the opposite view of Sam Harris, who holds that history, and I quote, is completely irrelevant.
That is by the way, teaser for my book. The title of the Sam Harris chapter is Totally Irrelevant. or if I may ad hom for a minute, as Sam Harris said to Ezra Klein in the debate, the history here is completely irrelevant.
All of a sudden, we can't talk about Neanderthal DNA anymore.
Oh, God. And people still ask me, like, do you think he's a toxic influence on culture? He only promotes really simplistic sophomore year philosophy and promotes all sorts of horrible ideas.
Scientific data can't be racist.
Yeah.
Okay, what would Hegel say about that?
Well, Hegel actually has...
Oh, I love that you gave that a real, actually.
Has one of the few things that's not committed the ad hominem fallacy. We went over this. That's not what it means. But the kind of thing that, people on Twitter would refer to as an ad hom. Hegel actually has a great ad hom about phrenology. About how, people who think that, the mind and spirit is importantly and out in skull shape, that we should test this by cracking their skulls. I'm not making that up. It's in Phenomenology of Spirit.
That's the perfect phrenology joke.
That is an amazing. Wow. And my stereotype is that Germans aren't funny. He's not even Jewish German. It's impressive.
Yeah. So Hegel has this view about historical progress towards freedom. So in Hegel's case, Hegel is an idealist, which is to say that he thinks that ideas are primary in a certain kind of way, and that this progress he sees through history, he's got this conception of the world spirit, which is this kind of mystical, quasi-religious idea of this sort of what's animated civilizations, to progress and have certain kinds of national character. But the through line of progress that he sees is about freedom from from the struggle with nature. So, that humans can subjugate nature to their own ends, which already, by the way, the world spirit part doesn't sound very Marxist, but that last part does sound Marxist.
Right.
And that's going to be a point of connection. So, but as far as dialectical methodology, Hegel knows, as he's offering this analysis of all of human history, basically, that to make this work, given this just astounding array of evidence that all these different cultures and societies at different times, any kind of like rigid, this is going to happen, then this is going to happen, very like straightforward story just isn't going to fit the data, which leads him to have this dialectical analysis. Of course, it's not that dialectics starts with Hegel exactly. He's coming out of stuff from previous thinkers going back to Aristotle, but he's putting the ideas together in a particular way. And Hegel thinks that you have to look at systems both as a whole, so you can see these points where there are these opposed tendencies that are pushing things in various directions, so you can see where the potential developments from there might be.
And is it also the notion too that in some ways you can understand a thing through its contradiction?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So,
and that's where being able to deal with that is very important.
Yeah. Yes.
That's the origin of Zizek's jealous husband joke too.
Yes.
Right. Like even the obsessively jealous husband, whether or not his wife is cheating on him is totally secondary to the function of jealousy. And you can't understand that without that position in place.
Yeah.
It's
right.
Trotsky there's a really good
Yeah.
Trotsky text on this, actually, the ABCs of dialectical materialism. And he has this line where he says, just like you can, envision a pound of sugar, but a pound of sugar that's covered in water is completely different than a pound of sugar that's covered in kerosene. Right? So the idea that these things are changing in the context of where they are actually.
Yeah.
Right.
And in that article, part of what Trotsky is talking about is, we say a pound of sugar. Well, it's never that there's any exact point where it's exactly a pound, right? That it's like 1 grain, more or less, right? It's actually this ever shifting quantity. And he says he's ultimately talking about a debate within the socialist movement about how to think about the Soviet Union, but he says that you should never think about the idea of a worker state in abstraction. You should think about this particular worker state in this particular time under these particular historical conditions. Just like you shouldn't think about capitalism in general, you should think about this stage in the development of capitalism in this time, this conditions. And so it's a way of, as you were saying, thinking about messiness and complexity without kind of losing the plot, right?
Right.
And I kind of have a love-hate relationship with that article. I talk about it in the book because I think that Trotsky's description of dialectical methodology is really good, but what he says about how that relates to like propositional logic, the kind of logic that's about looking at statements to see if they're true or false, and then to see, okay, if you construct this argument, if the premises are true, does the conclusion have to be true? I think Trotsky sees a relationship between those two things in that article because he's writing in the course of this faction fight with James Burnham, who is a philosophy professor at NYU and was bringing up some of the logic stuff to Trotsky, and Trotsky kind of overreacting to that, I think, sort of says, oh, that's wrong. You should be thinking about this way instead, when I think what he should have said is that's just irrelevant. That's a different thing, right? That they have that this dialectical method of analysis is totally compatible with classical, propositional logic. And in fact, the ways that I think some people might think they're opposed, this might seem like a digression, but I think it's worth a second on, is that you might think that, traditional logic is going to tell you that everything is either true or untrue or not both, and maybe that's going to erase certain kinds of messiness and complexity. But what I argue in the book is that actually exactly the opposite is true. That when we just use the same statement and then the negation of it, right? We say, oh yeah, P is true and not P is true as a way of kind of gesturing at complexity. we're not really getting into what makes it messy and complicated. And so actually what the requirement of logical consistency does is it forces us to spell out the respect in which things are P, the respect in which things are not P. And so that actually forces you to get into all that lovely Hegelian complexity.
And
spelling that out sounds somewhat invidious, and we don't really have time to clean up the mess.
That's MVP shit right there. So in Marx, and then is this the parallel with, is that Marx takes this and then just materializes it?
Yeah. So
the dialectic becomes, instead of like a contradiction about spirit expressing itself in the German sovereign or the French monarchy, it becomes the contradiction between modes of production, contradiction between, labor and ownership, capital and and value, and so on.
Yeah. Absolutely. Instead of, there's still the idea that of historical progress towards a certain notion of freedom. We talked about Marx's notion of freedom earlier, and freedom also from subjugation to the sort of struggle against nature. And I'd say as far as Marx's version of it, actually, one really interesting text to look at as far as Marx's progress, right? Marx starts out as a young Hegelian. There are like left Hegelians who are basically Hegelians who like democratic and even proto-socialist politics, and right Hegelians. And Marx starts out as left Hegelian. And one really interesting text to look at is one of, I think, the most unfairly maligned things that Marx ever wrote, which is on the Jewish question, which if you ever argue with this... If you ever,
Ben, it's kind of okay. David nodded a little too vigorously at that.
Okay. All right. I'm
God, let me tell you something.
Classrooms where even just the title.
Let me tell you something. That's a question you're going to need to ask, sir. Can't avoid. That's a question can't be avoided.
Yeah. Well, the title doesn't age well.
No, it's actually a great essay.
It sounds like something that was written by Richard Spencer.
Right.
And there are quotes which you can find from it where, where Marx is saying things that are not very woke by 21st century standards. And this is actually one of the things that, I know this makes me sound like an immensely grumpy old man, but I feel like this is a way in which the internet has made us all a little bit dumber.
Definitely.
That it used to be the case that if you wanted to quote mine a book, you had to actually pick up the book and flip through it to find the passage you wanted to quote. And in the course of flipping through it, you might at least accidentally get some sense of what the rest of the book was about.
Right.
Whereas if you've heard that there are these bad passages on the Jewish question, you can just Google the passage you want without contaminating yourself with any of the rest of the content of the book. So which is Marx reacting to some of these other left Hegelians who had more traditional Hegelian ideas, which is to say they thought that ideas rather than legal structures and material reality were the sort of prominent thing, the main force driving history. And so these people thought that in order to have Jewish emancipation, in other words, to change the laws so that Jewish people would have equal rights, then Jewish people would have to give up their own particular religious practices and cultural differences in order to become part of this kind of Republican unity, which is in fact exactly the kind of thinking that still exists, like with France, having, laws against, Muslim women wearing the hijab, things like that. And Marx is arguing against that because he thinks that there's a sort of objective material way of thinking about freedom, that you don't have to change the ideas in your head. You don't have to, like start eating pork to be like everybody else, right? That we can all just have this kind of legal equality. And if there is something that's incomplete about that kind of legal equality, Marx says that it's not that like everybody needs to have the same ideas in their heads so they're part of this great Republican unity. It's that we need social equality to put flesh on the bones of legal equality so that like we have an economic system under which people have meaningful equal status in practice.
Absolutely. You've just watched a Michael Brooks show video, and you can watch all of our full main live shows every Tuesday night at around 7 p.m. Eastern Time and subscribe to get all of the clips you want. We're covering the globe. We're focusing on international relations, the intellectual dark web. We're having fun. We're doing deep dives with a lot of amazing guests. Of course, become a patron for the whole thing at patreon.com/TMBS, or subscribe to this YouTube channel and help us keep growing and get that content out there. Subscribe below.